at forestry in Ireland. Around 10% of the land in Ireland is used for forestry at the moment, but that is increasing of late. Um, it's mainly conifers, um, your spruce and your pine trees. But again, that's changing lately as well. We don't have that many native conifers, and we've only recently really recognised the value of our broadleaf species. So, a lot of our more recent planting schemes have focused on broadleaf species rather than the conifers. Um, so that figure there of 25% on the broadleaf species might be increased as we speak. There are various different schemes that have been introduced in Ireland to encourage us to get back some of our forestry. The most recent one there is the GLOS scheme, which is running for, gosh, a good few years now at this stage. They've had a few tranches through the GLOS scheme, and that one would encourage you to plant a little grove of trees or even hedgerows around your land, up to 450 of our native broadleaf species. So you're talking your birch and your alder, your ash, oak, even hawthorn, things like that. And they would pay you probably, I think it was 90 cent per plant over 5 years for planting those native hedgerows. And that would be a scheme that was brought in under our European promises, I suppose, to increase sustainability of Irish agriculture. Now, conifers then, what do we mean when we say conifers? Well, most of our commercial growing of trees in Ireland uses Sitka spruce and some Scots pine, which is a native conifer. The broadleaf species then, as I said, it's increasing all the time, the use of broadleaves in our planting, and examples there include your ash, your birch and your oak. Now, where do we find forestry in Ireland? Well, not to make too much of it, but basically you'll find forestry where you can't grow anything else. So the better soils in Ireland are used for crops, for tillage, or for grassland for maintaining livestock on it. And then it's only the very poor quality soils that get given up for forestry because they can't do anything else. In that case, if you have poor quality soil that you can't do anything else on it, you probably wouldn't mind giving it up for the 40 years that it's going to take to grow your forestry. Some examples of soils that are suitable for that would be your acid brown earths, your brown podzolics and your grey brown podzolics. Now, acid brown earths with a little bit of correction for pH can be used for other things, but certainly the podzolics, your podzols and your glaze, you will find quite often devoted to forestry or even drained peat as well. Now, planting then. The most important thing to do if you're going to plant forestry is to select the most suitable tree for your soil type. And then you need to make sure that you get good quality trees. So your saplings should have straight stems, good healthy looking terminal bud, that's the bud up at the top of the plant, and a good fibrous root system, nice and healthy looking root system, so plenty of roots. If you're not going to plant them straight away, you need to store them in cool conditions and preferably heel them in, which is just put them into a temporary mound of earth. You make sure that the roots aren't exposed anyway. And then when you are planting them, you make sure it's generally done during what's called the dormant season for your trees, which would be throughout the winter. Generally, they would say anything with a burr is okay for planting seeds. So any month, or planting trees, any month with a burr. So I think from kind of September on, but really you try to leave it a little bit later. There's a slide coming up on that in a minute. Then before you go planting the trees, you do try to fence off the area. Young trees are subject to being grazed a little bit by animals, and that won't help them for sure. Even your hares, our native hares, do tend to um, try to eat parts of the barks of new trees, so you have to be careful on that. And then it's sown at a rate of 2,500 little saplings per hectare, and that's to take into account that each tree needs a 2 metre by 2 metre square or 4 metres squared to grow in when they're starting to grow. So when do you plant them? The broadleaf species, preferably a little bit later than your September. So you'd leave them go to maybe October, November, or December, and then other species would be planted, in the springtime. So what about fertilizer requirements? Of course, before you know what fertilizer you need, you're going to have to do a soil test, and that will inform your decisions then as to the fertilizer requirement, and maybe even it might direct you towards a particular species of tree. As per usual with any of the crops that we studied this year, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are all important in the growth of your trees, but in particular, your phosphorus is very important. And that brings us to look at the exact types of fertilizers that you might use. So 10-10-20, which is a good all-round fertilizer often used in tillage, and 18-6-12 are very commonly used. They should be applied between April and August. Why would you do that? Because you don't want to risk too much rainfall washing your fertilizer off into a little stream or anything, and for that reason as well, you need to be only applying them outside of 20 metres from the nearest waterway, so never get within 20 metres of a waterway when you're applying fertilizer, as that can lead to eutrophication, which is where you get nutrients into the water which cause an algal bloom, and then when the algae is being broken down by bacteria, the bacteria use up the oxygen in the water, and there's no oxygen for the fish, and you have a fish kill. Why have I thrown in ground rock phosphate here? You might remember from when we were doing the chapter on fertilizers that ground rock phosphate is often used in forestry as a source of phosphorus, because that's quite important for developing the roots of your trees to get that good fibrous root system, which is the most important thing in establishing your new young trees. And why ground rock phosphate as distinct from any other phosphorus fertilizer? Well, ground rock phosphate is released slowly. The phosphorus is released slowly, and when you have a growth period of 40 years for these trees, that's no issue having your ground rock phosphate released slowly in your acid soil. So it's particularly suitable for this context. It would be much too slow a release for using it on a tillage crop where you want a rapid response. Right, so what about weeds then? Well, weed growth is just as important really in your forestry as it is anywhere else. You need to try and stamp it out. The weeds will compete for water, for nutrients, and for light with the new trees. And you'll know this on a domestic scale. Even if you plant a tree at home, you would always be encouraged to clear the sod from around the base of the tree, and then maybe put down some mulch to prevent weeds from coming out and competing with that young tree for the nutrients, the water, etc. So on a commercial scale, you're not going to be clearing the sod, but what you might do is spray. So there are two options really for clearing your weeds and your vegetation. You can either go manual, which might work on a small scale and literally just involves cutting back the weeds, and it's environmentally friendly, which is a good advantage of doing manual weed control. Or if you're on a commercial scale, you'd probably use chemicals. So you'll spray with herbicides. Now, you have to be careful on spraying the herbicides. So if you get a particular selective herbicide, generally the way they would work is they will kill broadleaves and won't kill conifers. So and that only works if you get the dosage right, because if you were to spray too much of that selective herbicide, it would be the equivalent really of um, spraying an unselective herbicide, meaning it would kill all of your plants, including your conifers. So you must be very careful when you're spraying your herbicide to get the amount right, so that it will only kill off weeds and not kill off the conifers. Then, if you're talking about broadleaves themselves, you've got to be extremely careful and choose your herbicide very carefully and your dose very carefully there, because a lot of the selective herbicides would actually kill your broadleaf plants, just because they would, on a broader leaf, they'll absorb more of the herbicide. So you do have to be careful with that. So then, if everything goes well and you get to harvesting, um, there are two types of harvesting. So there's a harvesting that happens regularly throughout the lifespan of the tree, that's called, of the plantation, I should say, sorry, that's called thinning. And then there's a harvesting that's called clear felling, which only happens once, and that's at the end of the use of your particular plantation. So thinning, first of all, I'm sure you've come across it on a horticultural level. It means removing the poorer quality plants, to give a little bit more space to the better plants, and that reduces competition. So if you take out the weaker looking plants, the ones that haven't established very well, in this case trees, then you are clearing an area around those better, stronger trees to give them a good chance of thriving. They'll have more water when you've removed the competitors, they'll have more space, they'll have more access to light. So, overall, they're much more likely to thrive. You might find on a commercial level that after maybe 15 years, you're thinning one row out of every seven of the trees, just to help with light penetration and to reduce competition. Now, that tends to be planned out when you're talking about a commercial venture. And the way they plan it is they do a thing called brashing, first of all, where they essentially carve a path through the trees, so that they reduce the lower branches of the trees, and that gives them their path to walk through the trees and plan what ones they're going to thin. Then they would thin after maybe 20 years if you're talking about conifers. It's a bit earlier for the first broadleaf, and that they will remove some of the trees, as I said, and they're used for pulp, for the pallets, so the wood that's used to make pallets, and depending on how thick they are, they might be used for saw logs as well, which basically means used for timber. Then every 5 years after that, you will have more thinning going on, right up to the 40 years when you should reach maturity in your plantation. If you're talking about broadleaf, you tend to do the thinning every 10 years, and that's because the growth rate in the broadleaves is that bit slower. Now, clear felling then, as I mentioned, happens just once, and that's at the end. So at the end of your forestry crop cycle, you harvest all the trees in an area, and then you move on to another area and harvest all of those trees. Of course, that would be done for commercial purposes. So what are the benefits then of forestry? Well, it provides habitat and also food source for birds and animals. Planting trees can reduce leaching of nutrients out of soil, and that they bind the soil together and help with the structure. The trees remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. A lot of talk about that now, obviously, with our difficulties in Ireland and all over the world with global warming. It's a source of income for farmers. So if you sign up for, say, the GLAS scheme or one of those schemes, you will get a certain amount of money for your trees. Or if you happen to have a very poor land area and you devote it to forestry in the longer term, you can make quite a bit of money out of it. and let's face it, it wasn't going to be used for anything else anyway. Trees are aesthetically pleasing. People like to look at trees. There's something quite uplifting about looking at the strength of a tree and the beauty of some of our native species, like your sessile oak or your ash tree or any of the willow, birch, etc. Um, and then if you practice farm forestry, you will get shelter for neighbouring fields as well as those hedgerows grow. And that brings us up to a shelter belt, which is the last little point that we need to mention in forestry. And a shelter belt, as the name implies, is just a line of trees, or it can be a hedge, and it's planted to protect your crops or buildings or livestock from adverse weather conditions. You're primarily focused here on wind and rain, although they do sometimes get used as well in coastal regions just to stop from the salty spray coming in. Now, if you're planning a shelter belt, you can do just conifers or you can do just broadleaf if you wish, although you will leave yourself a little bit exposed with the broadleaves because they tend to be deciduous and therefore you won't have them right when you need them, which is during the winter. Or you might go for a mix of conifers and broadleaf, and sometimes that's for the best. If you do plan to mix, you're getting a mix of the evergreen conifer with the deciduous broadleaf, so you have different things to look at different times of the year, which brings in the aesthetic nature of it. You might like looking at the clumps of conifers, or you might like looking at the broadleaves going through. Some of the broadleaves have nice fruits on them at different types of year, or even flowers. Your conifers then tend to have a tall and thinner growth habit and they grow really quickly, whereas your broadleaves tend to be that little bit shorter, well, it depends on the species obviously, and have a thicker growth habit, so they tend to spread a bit and they definitely take longer to grow as well. And if you plan to mix, you're obviously enough promoting biodiversity because you'll have certain species that prefer certain types of tree to live in. That is it on forestry.